Every country has its own history, its own institutions, but the key is to develop institutions that can be trusted by the public as providing good analysis, good evidence, that are open to public participation in the processes, so the public can give ideas to this organisation, it can discuss them, put out proposals for public discussion, etc. In Australia, it's been helpful to the government for political learning about what is possible politically and what's not. Whereas otherwise the government often is risk averse about reform because it's worried that there'll be a bad political reaction. So the role of an organisation like this is not just to help the government understand what would be good policy, but also make it a bit easier to introduce good policy and reforms by educating the public a little bit, so they understand why reform is needed and what the benefits would be, not just costs, which is everybody hears about the costs, but as I say, in Australia, the private sector was crucially important in the politics of reform by supporting reforms once they understood that those reforms would be beneficial to them and their members. Then they became advocates, coalitions for reform, whereas before they had been quiet and passive, and all the noise politically was from those who were resisting reform in the industries who didn't want to have their protection reduced, for example. So that was quite important, and the governments in Australia often say that to industry, if you want us to reform, you've got to give us some support, and particularly in areas that are very sensitive and challenging, like labour market reform, which in every country I've been to around the world, the most difficult area for reform is always labour regulation, or what we call in Australia workplace regulation. Because for obvious reasons, you have the union involvement, it's about people, it's about their own living standards. And one of the great advantages of being a member of the OECD is the ability to learn from other countries, what policy experiments they've tried, what has been successful, what has failed, and so on. On the other hand, everything the OECD does is public, so you can go to their website and you can see a report from 2010 called Making Reform Happen, and that has case studies of successful reform in different countries, including in Latin America, and the ingredients in those things. So it's not the most important thing for any country to be a member, but I think for a country that's seeking to undertake reforms, being a member provides extra support, I think, which can be quite useful. And it's also a signal to your own people that your country, in a sense, has got to the stage where it's able to be in a club with other advanced industrial countries. So it's a strong signal about success. I do think in Peru that your government is focused on reform, and there are challenges that you mentioned, but in a lot of countries they haven't yet started even, whereas Peru has already done some significant reforms. It's quite open to the world economy, and there are more challenges to come, but at least I think in Peru there's a discussion and a focus on those things, and my very presence here and the presentations I've given over the couple of days to a lot of people have reinforced that I think there is a recognition in Peru that reform is needed. The challenge is to get it done.